All right, afternoon, evening, thanks for coming out. Sorry for the darkness in here, but you can't really see what's on the screen unless can't see each other. Do appreciate you coming out. If you ever want more pizza, just go out during the talk, get some more food, get some more drink. We don't mind, honestly. Just maybe try to be quiet while you're doing that. But welcome to the Central Ohio .NET Developer Group, or CONDG. We are on Meetup, which hopefully you found and can track our future meetings for. We are also on YouTube. So hello YouTube. We record and broadcast our meetings as technology works. So you can subscribe to us. The URL's right there. It's just CONDG as well. We're also on Twitter. So it's a good way of following us and keeping in touch as well. For consideration of the folks on YouTube, we do request that you maybe don't download game updates over our Wi-Fi here that we're improving, just to help people get a good experience. I won't be doing too many demos today, but it's just polite to not hog that bandwidth. Related to the bandwidth, thank you to our sponsors Improving for the meeting space, for the pizza, for the soft drinks, and just being very reliable and consistent. We do appreciate you. We also thank JetBrains for being our raffle sponsor. I'm actually talking a little bit about JetBrains and some of the things that they can do today as well, with tools like ReSharper and Writer and other things like that. So at the end of today, we will have a raffle for a license to a free JetBrains product for a year. So keep that in mind. Other nerdy groups in the area, we have the Central Ohio Azure group that meets every second Monday of the month. We believe that is still accurate. If it's not, and we keep saying things that are inaccurate, please let us know, and we will, we will fix it. We also have the Columbus JS group, which was the CBus JS until somewhat recently. Guy Royce runs that, very good group, very interesting group, so check them out. They also meet here. And then we have the CBus Data, formerly the CBus Pass group. So if you are inclined towards data, SQL Server, things like that, it's a good group to check out as well. They are active, they are still meeting, and they are very interesting if you're interested in those types of topics. As far as what we're talking about, well, today I am your speaker. I'm a sub this month. We have a whole lot of availability the rest of the year, as you can see. So if you are thinking about giving a talk about something that's interesting to you, it could be technologies you work with as a side project, could be just a passion that you care about that's related to .NET in some way, shape, or form. Come talk to us. Alan and I are right here. We'd love to hear what you want to talk about. We are very welcome to entertain new speakers. At this point, it's getting harder and harder and harder to schedule speakers. So talk to us. We'd love to have you. At some point, if this trend continues, we might need to start thinking about maybe doing like remote speakers. That's something we want to try to avoid, though, just to give you a better chance to interact with folks. But do talk with us if you're interested. Anybody here hiring? Raise your hand. Anybody here looking for work? Talk to the other people. So talk to each other afterwards. You are allowed to talk to each other. Networking's kind of a dirty word, but not really. And if you, if you are interested in helping out and maybe don't want to speak, we have other ways of helping out. So if you want to help with AV, Twitter, helping finding speakers, etc., just come talk to Alan, talk to me. Sam Gomez, our speaker last month, has joined our leadership team. So it is the three amigos now. But if you're interested in investing in this, come chat. And then that is all we have. So I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, who is me. Yeah, seamless transaction. And if I was smart, I'd have this all in the same deck, but I'm not that smart. Alrighty, if I can get my trackpad working. Cool.
I see one problem already.
Okay.
You're using Windows and everybody else just uses Mac when they're in here.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's a problem only for certain realities of problems. Okay. So I'm Matt Eland. I'm not going to be offended if you mispronounce Eland. I might be a little surprised if you mispronounce Matt. That'll shock me, but I'll still talk with you. I teach .NET professionally at Tech Elevator. I've been doing .NET since beta 2 back in 2001. And I do a lot of other stuff as well. Do a lot of AI stuff and things like that. By the way, the images on these slides, most of these images are AI-generated images that I had generated from some prompts using Midjourney. So you'll see some interesting images. I would encourage you not to try to count the number of fingers and toes. That would be my encouragement based on AI artwork. So what are we talking about today? Well, we're talking about making your code accessible to new team members. I'm saying new team members here, not new developers intentionally. Because your new team members, well, they might be new developers, they might be experienced developers who are finding a new team. And we're trying to take a look at code and the things in code that make your code accessible to new team members and the things in code that make your code maybe a little less accessible to team members. So if you are an experienced team member working in a team and maybe hiring some new people or looking to at some point in your future, there's some things I want you to take away from this talk. Right? You are my primary audience and I want you to understand what's hard about onboarding for an experienced developer or for a new developer. I want you to have some ideas for improving your onboarding experience for your new developers. And I want you to be able to more efficiently onboard new team members so they can be more effective, have a greater chance of success, have a greater degree of happiness, and a lower degree of anxiety. So these are some of the things I'm caring about with us. If you are a new developer, you're trying to get into the industry, you're somewhat new into the industry, this is what I'm hoping you're going to get out of this. I would like you to have some appreciation for the things that are going to stand in your way of success as you get into the industry. I want you to have some ideas for overcoming those obstacles. And I would like you to ultimately have a better chance of success of succeeding in the industry, of doing well in your first job, your second job, etc. Right? So that is sort of what we're talking about today. This talk is built as a tech agnostic talk. But I like .NET a lot, and we're talking to a .NET group, so my examples today are all going to be in .NET C#. Okay? So what problem do we have other than digits on fingers and things like that? Well, the technologies that we work with are old. The technologies that I work with on a day-to-day basis, most of them existed when I was in high school. Okay? If you look at .NET changes a lot. So this is a little timeline I built a few years ago, taking a look at the history of .NET up till about the year 2021 at the time. And this is just a screenshot from 2018 to 2020. These are all the major releases of .NET, Visual Studio, C#, F#, Visual Basic, and other things related to that. This is just a 2-year time period where we have all these new features, all these new language features, all these new standards. Certain products are getting retired, certain products are coming about that are new. This is not an unusual screenshot from the history of .NET. .NET, and one of the things we like about it, one of the things why it stays relevant after 20 years of development, is it keeps evolving as technology keeps evolving. We keep gaining new features, new ways of doing things. Every year in the fall, Microsoft releases a new version of .NET. And alongside that, they release new versions of C#, F#, and VB, usually with a few new features. Now, most of the time, it's not stuff you care about, but sometimes, there's some things that some team might say, hey, that's kind of cool. I'd like to play around with that in our code. And for you, if you're in the industry for a while, that's not a big deal. You're staying current. That's good. That's healthy. You need to do that. And you're like, hey, this is a cool new feature that they added. Let's try that in our code. And you do that every year. Well, when you learned .NET was, let's say, 10 years old. But now, people who are learning it, it's 20 years old or 21 years old. And now there's 10 more years of new changes coming out every fall that they are now adapting to. They are having to adjust to these changes. They're having to learn these new features, and they're having to learn when to use them. So our languages are evolving over time. C# is not static. It is a language that is just growing over time. The static is a thing in C#. Show of hands, who here is familiar with Silverlight? Okay. Who here has developed in Silverlight? Sorry, Brad. So Silverlight was a Microsoft technology. Silverlight was Microsoft's web technology. They took their desktop application technology because 20 years ago, the big thing to do was desktop application development. It's how we thought about computers and technology. And then this guy named Steve Jobs comes around, and he develops the iPhone and the iPad. And people say, oh, well, technology isn't just a desktop application anymore. It's a small, lightweight app that goes on your mobile device. And they said, ooh, well, maybe it's not that anymore. Maybe it's a website that works fine in a browser or in a mobile device. And so what an application was changed from a desktop application that you install to a website that you visit. Right? Silverlight was Microsoft's way of trying to adapt. They said, hey, we're going to let you run the same code that you used for your desktop applications on Windows in your browser. And for a while, I was a specialist in Silverlight. This is what I did as a career. This was my specialty, and people would hire me and pay me, modest amount of money to build applications for the web browser. And then one year, Chrome says, hey, Flash and Silverlight, they're cool and all, but wouldn't it be cooler if our browser was just a little bit faster? And they said, hey, starting next year, we're getting rid of plugin support. So we're not going to run Silverlight. We're not going to run Flash. If you were relying on those, well, it sucks to be you. And if you're a Silverlight specialist, like I was at the time, it sucks to be you. So technologies change over time. This was maybe a more pronounced example, but technologies shift over time, and what's popular will shift over time. The standards that we have as technologists will change over time, too. So a few years ago, we would all say everything should be a microservice. Microservices are flexible, they're scalable, we can independently deploy them and release them, and they can handle whatever load they need to. Like everything should be a microservice, and every microservice should have 5 microservices inside of it. And then, fast forward a couple years, and nowadays we're starting to think, there maybe might be some drawbacks with microservices, right? This can happen at a technology level. This can also happen like inside of C#. I have been a part of many teams that said everything needs to be an interface, everything needs to have an interface. And then we fast forward a year and it's like, oh my gosh, whenever I want to make a change, I have to modify 3 different files, and this is just ridiculous. I'm not getting as much value as I'm getting penalty from this. So the standards that we agree are good one day might change the next day. We have this constant evolution inside of tech. In fact, it's part of what's popular, what works, and what's considered to be a good practice. But that's not the only thing that changes over time. The requirements that we are having to implement change over time. We might be a part of a startup and we think, hey, we're trying to build a company that sells yo-yos to people in Spain. Random theme generator here. And then you realize, oh, we're not really selling that much. Our software now needs to control cars that can fly. Just completely random examples here. But these kinds of requirement shifts are somewhat normal, maybe not that extreme, but they're somewhat normal. And you might think you're building a class that handles X when your business needs evolve, or you misunderstood some requirement that the product guys had. And it's like, oh, okay, all of a sudden, I need to adapt the code that I already have to serve this new functionality. You usually don't get to rewrite your whole code. You have some code, you need to adapt it. So the code that you built to serve something now has to serve something else. This is part of how we get technical debt in our code. People change as well. What's important to somebody is going to change over time. I've worked with plenty of people who really cared about upward mobility and performance and all these things, and then they get married, they have a family, and what they care about changes. They care about balance, they care about flexibility in life, they care about all these other things, right? So the people on your team are going to change over time. The people making the decisions are going to change over time. And so the decisions they make will change over time. So there's all this chaos in all sorts of areas affecting our code. Whether it's us changing, whether it's the technologies we work with changing, the languages evolving, the requirements evolving, because that never happens. These are all things that cause chaos in our code. And this chaos has a very real impact. Typically, we would call this like technical debt would be a lot of this where we have code that isn't necessarily the way it should be. And that affects a lot of projects. And this has a lot of impacts. And this impacts people coming onto your team, because those people coming on your team, they have a growing degree of a burden they have as they're trying to learn. So your new learners, whether they're experienced developers or brand new developers off the turnip truck, says the man who drives the turnip truck, your new developers have a pretty steep learning curve. And every year, the amount of things that your new developers have to grapple with grows as we get more and more features in our languages, as we get more and more tools, more and more processes. There's just a lot that we have to be lifting in order to be a software developer, and that amount is only growing over time. And this can cause anxiety. It causes a lot of anxieties. You're looking over job requirements and like, oh my gosh, I have to have 5 years of experience in this. I've never heard of this before. Oh my gosh, they're working with this library. I've heard of this, but I've never worked with it. Okay, I know I've heard of Terraform, but I've never used it. Can I really apply to this? And there's this anxiety that creeps in of, am I adequate? Am I going to be able to perform in this job? And this anxiety of, okay, I'm looking at the candidate pool and nobody has everything that I want. Right? So we have this growing degree of anxiety, and this anxiety and all these learning curves, it sort of brings about this slower onboarding process that we have, right? It's now slower to get started because you got to figure out, okay, what systems do we have here? What code do we have here? How do I get the code? How do I run the code? How do I build the code? How do I deploy to production? What's the process of doing this? How do we do approvals? How do we do branching? There's all of these things. What are these tools? What are these things? And it might be stuff you've heard of. It might have been something internal that the company made 5 years ago and now regrets. But there's all these things that cause us to slow down as new developers joining a team. And some of this, if it gets too extreme, they can actually cause you to fail to onboard successfully. You might be too overwhelmed. You might be too slow to really succeed in your job. And you might decide it's time for something else, or your employer might decide that for you. Right? So the growing degree of complexity you have is going to reduce your odds of success. It also, there's a growing number of things that we can care about as technologists, and this, I don't know if anybody else has seen this in their career, but it might lead to something that I call a difference of opinion, where different people have like just different opinions about everything going on. By the way, my favorite part of this is this set of legs right here. I can't figure out who that even is going to belong to. Midjourney's great, by the way. But there's a lot of things we can disagree about. We talk about tabs versus spaces as a joke, but there's a lot of preferences developers can have. So let's talk about maybe some ways of reducing this friction as you're getting on board in your new organization. You're trying to figure out what's what. You're trying to figure out how to do your job. Well, documentation can help, but often documentation is out of date or confusing, as this Lego diagram is. By the way, Reddit's wonderful. Documentation can be helpful. One of my favorite talks at CodeMash 2023, or sorry, CodeMash 10,000, was Jeffrey A. Where are you? Can't see. There you are. Okay. You did a talk on, what was the title of that talk?
Your hands-on with your second brain.
Yeah, building a second brain, based on the book Building a Second Brain. And one of the key takeaways there was, hey, as you're getting new knowledge, you want to catalog that knowledge. I would strongly encourage you and your organization to have a wiki, have some sort of an internal documentation hub. You want one central place of contact where somebody can go to find links to the information they're looking for, whether it's HR, whether it is the architecture of our systems, whether it is how do I merge my code into production. You want to have a centralized place where you can go and find knowledge. This is a screenshot of Obsidian, but something like Confluence could work just fine. There's a lot of wiki software, there's a lot of things that could work, but even a Google Doc that you share as a team is a decent starting point. Just have some central place that you and your team can go and like, hey, you have a question, see if it's in the knowledge base, see if it's in over here, right? There's free tools, there's commercial tools, but have something. Because when's the last time that you onboarded somebody and they had everything they needed to set up their machine to do their job? Now, if you are a small organization, you don't hire that often, you probably don't have your machine set up that documented. So your new hire gets a new laptop, sure, but now they need to figure out, okay, well, what software do I need to put on this? What versions of that software am I putting on this? What order do I install these things in? What configurations options do I choose when I am installing SQL Server? What users do I need to set up on my local machine? All these little things that you need to configure. And this is the kind of thing that does get out of date pretty quickly. So my recommendations to you as an organization, if you're hiring people regularly, is document this, right? As you're setting somebody up, they're going to run into stuff. Write down the stuff that they bump into. Write down the stuff that you have to install in what order to get a valid machine working. So the next person that joins your team has a list. That list might be out of date because you haven't updated it in 9 months or whatever, but you have a starting point, and then you update it as they're learning something. Another thing that might help with this, even if you're not actively hiring, would be you're probably rotating out laptops for developers on some periodic basis. I might encourage you to rotate people on an irregular basis. So you get a team of four people. Let's say they get a new laptop every other year. Well, maybe in the spring of this year, you're updating the yeah, it does sound nice.
6 or 7.
Yeah, 6 or 7 is a little bit more regular. Yeah, but let's say in spring you're rotating person A, and then in the fall you're rotating person B, and the next spring it's person C, and the following fall it'd be person D. That way you're not too far out from the last person updating their machine and having to set up their machine, because the farther out you go from having to set up your machine, the more risk you have in not knowing what a good configuration is for a new environment. Right? There are things like containers and images and things like that can make this easier, but this is often something that an organization is going to struggle with. And this will slow down your new hires more than you think. Systems environments. There's a lot of systems we have in our organizations. Even the small organizations will have a lot of systems. But your large organizations are going to have all these departments and teams and systems, and it's just overwhelming. Especially if you're naming your system stuff like Hydra instead of email server, right? That never happens, right? It's going to confuse your new hires. Document the systems. Just at least say, hey, this is this system. It's owned by Team X. It does Y. So you have a listing of these systems. Better yet would be a diagram of how these systems work together, but have some idea of like, hey, here's what you have to deal with. Documenting your environments that you have would be helpful as well. If you have a developer environment, if you have a testing environment, you have a staging environment, you have a production environment, maybe 2 production environments you swap between, something like that, just have that documented, or better yet diagrammed somewhere, so that you can give your new developers a starting point for understanding what's on your systems. Now, if you're joining an organization they don't have this, my recommendation is you start sketching it yourself. You don't have to make it formal, you don't have to share it with anybody. But my experience has been the more I diagram the things that I'm working with, whether it's processes or systems or whatever, the more I understand the nature of the organization that I'm joining. Databases. Databases are another one that you'll often have a diagram for already. It might be generated by a tool. It might be an old diagram that somebody created that's now slightly out of date. These are really handy to have around, really good to have in your wikis for people to be able to say, hey, what tables do we have? But even if your organization already has something like this, I would encourage you, as you're starting out, you're working on your first feature or first few features, I would encourage you to start sketching your little entity relationship diagram as you're building your own queries, because that physical act of sketching it doesn't take that much time, and sketching it on paper or on a whiteboard is going to help you internalize the relationships between these tables a little faster, even if it's already documented elsewhere. That's been really effective for me. Raise your hand if you're familiar with CICD. Right. CICD stands for Continuous Integration, Continuous Delivery, or Deployment, depending on who you talk to for the D. But it's the idea that you are always able to deliver. When you're checking in a fix, you're checking in a new feature, you have tests that run in a pipeline. There are tests that are running automatically. They're making sure it's good. You maybe be checking to see if it meets your organization's standards, if you're lucky. And then your CICD might even deploy it automatically to a target environment. So I check in a new feature, it shows up automatically in the testing environment, so my testers can take a look at it. I don't have to trigger anything. There's a lot of power in this. But documenting the way this works is going to be really important for your new developers to understand it, because every organization does this a little bit differently. Every organization has slightly different triggers, slightly different rules, slightly different standards. So document those so your new hires know. Similarly, every organization does code reviews a little bit differently. If you're lucky enough to be in an organization that does code reviews at all. Now, if you're not, you can say, please, sir, may I have another code review? I don't like this code. Can you please take a look at it? And hopefully your senior devs say, sure, let me take a look real quick. But hopefully you're part of an organization that is reviewing your code. Hopefully you, even as a junior developer, are able to review other people's codes. Because a developer with 3 months of experience, they still have insight into other people's code. They can take a look at code and they can say, hey, this is interesting. Why are you making that decision? You can even learn from that as you're doing a code review, right? So document your process for code reviews. Every organization does branching differently in my experience. I've never been a part of 2 organizations that branch the same way, using Git or whatever you're using for source code. Most of the days, nowadays it's Git, but I've never seen 2 organizations use the same branching schema for Git. And actually, I don't even teach branching to my students because everybody's so different in what they expect from a branching perspective. So have your standards for working on a new feature, starting work on it, to getting it ready for code review. Have those documented so people can say, okay, this is what I need to do. If you're feeling extra nice, you might want to document the exact steps you do in Git Bash to create these branches, right? Because that will help your newer developers as well if they're not that comfortable with Git yet. And I've actually worked with CEOs who are still doing development who are not that comfortable with Git, and this will be helpful for them. You think I joke. I am not. Okay. Standards. If your organization has standards for code, yay, good. That's nice. Document them. Document like, hey, here's what we care about. Here's what we care about the most. Here's how we see if your code meets those standards. If your standards have automation, that's awesome. Talk about how that works. If your standards don't, it's probably more important to say, hey, we don't use var here. Hey, we really prefer that you make everything private by default, or whatever your standards might be. And you have a reason for the standards that you've chosen. Another thing that's probably the least of your priorities as a dev team, but is important to document in your wiki, is HR. A surprising amount of a new hire's time is going to be taken up by HR concerns. Hey, how do I request PTO? How do I check on my insurance benefits? How do I check on my pay? How do I adjust X? You don't have to have that documented verbosely, but you should have links to the HR systems, especially things that people do infrequently, like requesting time off, requesting vacation time, changing the health insurance, stuff like that. Have a link to some HR system would be my advice, because that reduces the anxiety of your team. You're like, I am not sure how I ask for time off next week or what the process is for this. Just have some links for people. It's really helpful. It's more helpful than you'd think. Hopefully you all know what code comments are. If you don't, I need to go home and cry. But code comments are really helpful to a point. As you are working on your code, comment that code. But don't give me 8 lines of documentation on a method if it doesn't require it. Because once you get a certain length of comments on a method, my eyes start glazing over, and I'm not spending my time reading your comments because I'm figuring that you're talking about exactly what every line of code does, and I can read that myself because I'm a developer. But talking about why you made your decisions is important. Why are we doing this? What does this number mean? Why aren't we doing this other thing? That's an important thing to document, because somebody's going to come along someday and say, oh, Matt did not know what he is doing. He chose to do it this way. I really think it should be this because of my personal and religious preferences. I'm going to change it. Well, turns out Matt did it this way to avoid a bug or to avoid some sort of catastrophic meltdown, but Matt forgot to document it, so that's bad. Having a good degree of code comments is nice. You don't want to go overkill, because then you're not going to want to update your documentation. But you do want to have some documentation in your code. I like to have comments for the public methods. I like to have comments for what my classes do. And if there's anything interesting, I like to highlight that. Using blank lines to call attention to stuff is totally fine as well. Just keep in mind that the more text you have, the less likely someone is to actually read that text. And that's counterintuitive. Your unit tests can serve as documentation. You all are testing, right? The names of your tests alone can tell you about how the system should work. The names of your tests will tell you what your system cares about, what entities you're dealing with, and maybe why that code does what it does. Looking at the details of a particular test will also tell you, oh, here's how I instantiate this class. Oh, here's how I configure this. If I'm doing this, this is what I need to care about. So it can tell you how your code works. So as you're joining an organization, take a look at their tests, see how the tests work. If the tests don't exist, you might not be getting a lot of sleep in the next month or so, but you can help them fix that too. All right, so these are some things with documentation that are helpful. Let's talk about things that are particularly helpful for the newer developers joining your team. And I don't know why they have 4 nostrils either, but I do like the picture, so I kept it. Yeah, AI is going to take over the world, but it has some anatomy research it needs to do first. So there are some problems out there that are unique to new developers. Just keep in mind that your new developers are not going to be as fast as you want them to be. They're dealing with a lot. They're learning what organizations even do. They're learning your organization's processes. They're learning the structure of your organization. They're really learning how to be a developer as well as how to be a developer in your organization with your code. So they are learning a lot. So be patient with them to a point. One of the things that new developers are going to do is they're going to look at your code and they're going to say, is this how this should be? Is this code right? Or worse, your developers are going to look at your code and say, oh, this is how it should be. Right? There is technical debt out there. The code that you have in production is not necessarily the code that you wish you had in production. But your new hires don't necessarily know that. They don't know that you wish you hadn't written it that way. If you had to write it today, you'd write it a little bit differently. This is a lot differently, potentially, yes. I've been there. This is a problem because your new developers are going to be more prone to copy-paste driven development, where you're saying, oh, over here's how we did it to do this. I'm going to copy this code, I'm going to paste it over here, I'm going to modify a few lines, and let's see if it works. Well, cool, you just spread technical debt into new code. Good job, you. But your new developer doesn't know that, right? Like, you need to tell them, hey, here's what our code is. We're not necessarily proud of this. You need to understand we're not proud of this. We're responsible for this. We're not proud of this. You might not even be responsible for it. Tell them the stuff that sucks about your code. They are old enough, they are big enough, they are responsible enough to understand it. They might not understand everything that you're saying about what you would have done differently, but if they understand, hey, this isn't necessarily something I should just copy and paste without thinking about it, that's helpful to your new team members, right? Be transparent about your technical debt. Your new developers might not be able to see it, or they'll see it, but maybe not be able to put their finger on it. Also keep in mind that the architectures we choose have an impact on our new devs. When I started out, we did desktop applications, console applications, Windows Forms applications even. And we had basically a one-tier application. Maybe we had a two-tier if we had a database that we were talking to. But that was it, and that was what we focused on. And nowadays, we fast forward 5, 6, 7 years ago to the mid-2000s, and you're looking at a three-tier or n-tier architecture where you have a client side, you have a server that you're talking to with an API request, and you have a database. Okay? This might look simple to those of you with experience, but a new developer is struggling to figure out, okay, I'm getting a bug. Is my bug on the client side? Is it on the server side? Is it in the database? Is it in the way things are communicating? And it's going to take them a while to understand where that bug happens. One of the things I think that we do really, really well at my employer is we help people debug things. We help them learn that skill of debugging. My students, this is coming next week. Yay, you'll thank me later. But this is a hard skill that people have to learn. You have to learn, hey, what's broken and what are all the moving pieces? But this is rarely, well, maybe not that rarely, but this is rarely what it looks like in production for us. So most of the time you have an organization, they have some degree of success, and so they have some degree of traffic coming into their site. And so they might look something a little bit more like this, where you have a web application, but you have maybe a load balancer and a pool of servers that a request might go to. And this is going to boggle the mind of your new developers. They're like, wait, I don't understand. Wait, which server is it going to? I'm like, I don't know. Like, what do you mean you don't know? Isn't this your code? Like, no. We don't know which server the request is going to go to, but that's fine. And you have to explain these concepts to them. It gets harder for them to internalize your systems, right? This is a perfectly fine and valid architecture, but the more complexity you have in your architecture, the harder it's going to be for your new devs to debug it. I'm not saying don't have hard architectures. I'm just saying they do come with a price, and you will maybe need to explain them a little bit more than you might think you might need to. It's going to slow people down a little bit. If you have a partitioned database, that's another degree that this can expand a little bit. But if you're using the dreaded microservices, well, now your new developer has an infinite amount of more things to learn, because they're looking at, okay, I'm trying to build this application. Okay, I'm in this microservice. How do I get this information? Do I have this information? Oh, I don't? Who has this information? Who do I need to talk to? What team maintains that? How do I authenticate with that team? What happens if it's down? What do I do then? What kind of requests do I need to send? So your new developers are now needing to learn what all of these microservices you have are, how to handle if they're down or up. You're needing to be able to understand responses for them, how to make your requests to them, which might be different. You're needing to understand which team to talk to, who maintains this. And if you maintain this, now they need to say, hey, is the process for maintaining this one the same as the process for maintaining that one? So with great power comes great complexity, And frankly, microservices might have too much complexity that outweighs the benefit. But sometimes you do really need them. Just keep in mind that it's going to slow down the onboarding process for your new devs. Keep the stuff documented. Who maintains the system? What's it do? What's a sample request of the system look like? This is the stuff you want to document. And keep in mind that if you're using something like Docker or Kubernetes and dealing with containers, that's another level of abstraction that's going to kind of slow down your new learners. Because now they're not just dealing with code, they're dealing with containers, and they need to say, well, what is a container? And how do I deploy a container? How do I update it? And how do I, all these things, right? So these are all little things that can slow down your development time and slow down your onboarding time for your new devs. I'm not saying don't use them. I'm just saying keep it simple, silly, okay? The more simple you can keep your systems, the better time you're gonna have as an experienced developer, and your new developers are gonna have a much better time because they'll be able to debug it a lot faster. They'll be able to learn it a lot faster. They'll be able to feel confident a lot more quickly, right? That confidence that somebody feels is a big, big thing. Don't underestimate that, because if you feel confident in what the things you're building, the things you're developing, you're gonna be faster no matter what. Okay, so let's talk about some code things that make your code harder for a new developer to onboard. We talked about .NET and how it changes every year. We grow in features every year. Properties are one of the things that I teach in C#. Properties are one of the things that are harder for new developers to understand than you would think. It's a lot harder for people to understand properties than you would expect. And part of that is I've counted the number of ways you can declare a property in C#. Any guesses as to how many different ways of declaring property you have in C# right now?
17.
You've talked to me before.
No, I like the number 17.
That's the right number. It actually might have increased last fall because we got init-only properties or required properties. But yeah, pretty recently it was 17. Like they're all almost the same, right? Like it's the same concept, just with slightly different pieces of sugar on there. So properties are one of those things that if you can standardize on how you're doing them as a team, it's going to help your new developers out, because now there's one way that they can track. But if you're a part of an organization, you're like, hey, I could write my derived property like this. Well, cool. But I don't really want to write 5 lines of code when I could write, a little arrow expression, a little lambda expression. It's the same thing, but your new hires don't necessarily know that's the same thing. This is perfectly valid C# code. This is identical to the class above. And yet, this is going to trip up your new developer in more than a few ways. So your new developer is going to say, first of all, what the heck is this chonk arrow, this fat arrow thing doing here? What does this even mean? And once they figure out it's a lambda expression, then they're saying, okay, well, what does this actually do? Oh, okay, that's what that does. But then their learning journey isn't done, because the first thing they do is they're learning the concept and the syntax, usually hand in hand. Sometimes they learn the syntax first and then the concept, sometimes the concept and then the syntax. It's really hit or miss. But then they need to figure out, okay, so I can declare a property using the get, or I can declare a property using the little fat arrow. Which should I do which? Which one's better? Well, what do you mean one's not better than the other? Like, what do you mean I get to pick? And that consumes a lot more thinking time than you would expect for your new developers. I would encourage you to maybe choose some standards for your organization for when to use what language features, and be consistent. Consistency has a lot of benefits, okay? I'm not saying don't do this, I'm just saying it has a price when you do this. var. var is another keyword that it often evokes feelings. So var basically means, hey compiler, guess what type I mean. Hey compiler, guess what type I mean based on the return type of calculate value. If it can't guess, it gives you compiler error. This is nice for people like me who don't like to type a whole lot. But this is maybe not that great for somebody who's trying to learn, and they're learning all these keywords. They know var from the JavaScript side of things. They know var is kind of like an old way of on the type, right? So say, hey, this is a string, let's just use string. Now, you can't always do this, because your types aren't always string. Sometimes you're dealing with an I-ordered collection of key value pairs with good keys and dictionary values that are dictionaries of strings and booleans. In that case, I don't want to type that out, so I'm going to use var. But if I'm dealing with that, I got to rethink some of my life choices, because like I don't want to deal with that. Like, let's create a new type for that, right? Var is one of those keywords I would encourage you to use very, very, very sparingly, especially with things like the target type new that just came around in .NET. So you can say like dictionary of string bool equals new, and it just knows, oh, okay, you wanted it to be a new string bool dictionary. I love that feature.
That's
so wonderful. Yeah. But even that comes with its baggage, because guess what I don't teach as I'm teaching my students? I don't teach them target type new because it's somewhat new. No pun intended, sorry. Other things that have come up recently is we used to have classes and structs and interfaces, and that was it. And now we're dealing with record types and record structs and record classes and all these things, and we're dealing with required properties and init-only properties and all these added keywords that we have to deal with. And all these things can help add value to your organization, but if you are just like treating this like Pokemon, you got to catch them all, you got to have all the keywords in your C# files. Well, now your devs are coming along, they're reading your code, and they're like, okay, well, I'm trying to fix a bug, and oh my gosh, what the heck does required even mean? I've never seen that keyword before in my life. And now they're trying to figure out where to find it. They're going off on a Google search, and they might click the wrong link, and now they're trying to figure out what this old page is talking about. It's not even talking about something that would be helpful for them. And they're kind of just going off and they're yak shaving. They're not sure what they're trying to do. They lost what they were trying to do. So you use a new fancy keyword, cool for you, but maybe not so good for the new developer trying to accomplish her task. Right? So these things, these are when you start adding keywords to your code, new language features, you might want to add like a sentence or two to your documentation and say like, hey, we're using this feature now. This is a newer .NET feature. Here's a link to a blog post explaining it. Here's a link to the official MSDN documentation, or sorry, Microsoft Learn documentation, explaining how this feature works. This actually isn't just helpful to your new devs. I've worked with a lot of experienced devs who don't like to stay current, and so stuff like this can surprise them, right? And having links and documentation to this, having lunch and learns as new versions of .NET come out, can be really healthy for you and your team. So this stuff can be helpful, but use it in moderation. And I have some other advice on like where you ought to use this stuff in a minute. Final one here, with expressions. Anybody seen a with expression before? Okay, there we go, we got one. So with expressions basically says, hey, I want something that looks exactly like P1 with a couple differences. So it's like P1 except these properties are a little bit different. It's almost a different way of calling a constructor. It looks very alien. This is maybe where .NET is moving the most in recent years, where we're looking at avoiding constructors with lots of methods, or sorry, lots of parameters to them, and instead using things like the required and init-only keywords and the with expressions for creating your objects. This is all extra stuff your developers are now having to learn as they're seeing it in your code. So treat this like seasoning. Maybe don't put it everywhere. If you are going to put it everywhere, have a meeting with your team and talk about what this is, how this works, document it for future hires, and bring it as part of your onboarding. Like, just because it's cool and you want to play with it doesn't mean it needs to go in your production code right away. That's what side projects are for. So there's other things that can slow people down. These are not bad things, right? Like switch expressions versus switch statements. Switch expressions a little bit more new. Pattern matching is a little bit related to that. Recently, 2-3 years ago, we got better nullability checks for .NET. I really like that. But your new developers are now needing to deal with question marks and exclamation marks and all these little annotations they didn't need to worry about before. They didn't need to deal with nullability when they didn't before. They would have just said, oh, I need an if statement around this, if not equal to null. This ultimately helps your quality, so it might be worth your organization doing, but you need to be very verbose about, like, hey, here's what this is. Here's how this works. Here's how you get around this type of error. You're going to have to handhold your team more and more as you adapt these standards. And just keep in mind, your new devs might not be familiar with all these operators, because we're dealing with 20 years of baggage and 10 new features a year. It adds up quite a bit. Ternary operators, those are usually ones people are familiar with, but they'll slow you down. You don't necessarily learn ternary and think as quickly reading a ternary statement as you do reading an if-else. Null coalescing operator, that's a double question mark. That's another very similar related thing. Async await, you can't always get around. And in fact, it's often good to have async and await, but dealing with asynchronous code is going to cause your new developers to maybe make some more bugs than they might otherwise make, and it's going to slow down your devs as well a little bit. So just keep in mind that every feature you're using has a little price associated with it that might be bigger than you think as far as the impact on new people that you hire on or even the experienced people already on your team. Okay, so that's talking about the cognitive complexity that we have to deal with as developers, all this stuff that's cool and shiny and people like me love when it comes out every year, but it's going to slow down your team if you just sprinkle it everywhere on your code all at once. Okay, so manage your complexity, keep in mind what features you need versus what features are just kind of cool and shiny. Right? Like I would argue that using nullability is probably worth the complexity. But using ternary, I don't know. Maybe. If you use it everywhere and your team is really good at reading it, cool. But it's probably not worth it otherwise. I would advocate for ski trail indicators. So you have a mountain of your code. And not all parts of your code are created equal. You have your controller methods that are pretty similar. You got your data access objects that are pretty similar. Those might be your bunny trails, right? Your new devs are like, oh, I've seen this before. I've not seen this file before, but this follows patterns I'm familiar with. I've seen a data access object before. I've seen a controller before. Okay, cool. And then you got your authentication code, which is your double black diamond code that's like, okay, don't touch this code unless you have a lot of experience. And even if you have a lot of experience, get somebody else to proof your code. Test your code, test the snot out of your code. This code has to be right, always. It might be cool to stick to the simple stuff for your bunny trails, for your simple stuff. And for your more advanced stuff, that's where maybe you start introducing the more advanced .NET things to help support your advanced use cases. Right? So there might be areas of your code that you might want to stay simple, and areas of your code you might be more free to experiment with the complexity based on the seniority of the people who are likely working with there. So new devs, as they are learning, as they're getting used to their code base, keep them focused in an area or two. Let's say, hey, I'm going to give you 5 bugs related to this area of the application. This is what you're going to be working on this sprint. We're going to get you used to this area and working with this area. And next sprint, we're going to give you something related to it, but maybe a little bit more of a reach. We'll have you working with another aspect of the system, right? And be intentional about the areas that you need your new devs to grow. Some new developers will thrive on being thrown everywhere in your system. Some new developers, more new developers, are going to thrive based on owning a corner of the system and being comfortable with that and then expanding out and exploring to similar systems or related areas. Okay, so figure out who's on your team, figure out what makes them tick, and give them things that play to their strengths when you can. You can't always control what bugs come in, and sometimes you need to give a junior dev something that they have no idea on. Like, hey, I'm really busy with this other thing, see if you can figure this out. If you can't, that's cool, but take today, try to see if you can replicate and fix the bug. And we'll check in tomorrow. One of the things that I found probably a little too late in my career, it would have been really helpful earlier on, is there's a lot of power in asking questions. So whenever I join a new team, whenever I am learning a new system or new technology, I'm going to try to get my own understanding of something, and then I'm going to talk to a team member who's been here longer, or somebody with a little bit more experience, and say, hey, I think I understand how this works. Do you mind if I explain it to you, and you tell me where I got right and what I got wrong? I'm like, okay, so I think that when a request comes in, we got to check this thing over here to see if they're authenticated, and then we have to store it in this auditing service, and then we have to respond using this little helper that Bob built over here. Is that about right? And now 2 things are going to happen. Either you're going to say, yeah, that's exactly right, good job, Matt. And now I'm like, okay, cool, I'm getting this. I'm understanding the system. They're going to say, oh, that's not quite right. There's actually this microservice over here that we need to talk to about X. And now I have validated some parts of my understanding, but I've also helped myself learn what I need to learn more. I've found a missing piece, right? So I would do this fairly regularly with somebody you trust. Hey, do you mind if I try to explain how this works and you tell me what I'm missing? I find this is a really, really, really helpful technique whenever you're learning something, whether it's a new technology or whether it's a system that somebody has. So I would encourage you to encourage your new hires to do this and give them the trust and safety that they need to ask you these questions. So those are what our newbies need. What about our experienced developers? What needs do they have? Well, your experienced warlocks, wizards, and witches, they have a little bit more knowledge. And so when they join your organization, Well, they know what technical debt looks like because they've caused it before. And they know they didn't cause your technical debt.
Or
And
they've been handed it.
yes, you are often handed technical debt, but your new hires don't necessarily even know that. Like, hey, I've been here 3 weeks. This isn't my code, sorry. But your new hires might not know that. So keep in mind that your new hires are going to see your technical debt and judge you by it. So this makes it maybe even more important to talk to them and say, like, hey, this is not how we would have written our system. If we had to do it again today, we are aware of these issues. We want to prioritize this. We need to kind of balance out what the business needs with our needs for prioritizing technical debt. We don't like this. New hires going to be like, okay, I don't necessarily love that answer, but that makes sense. And if you talk about some areas of technical debt and the new hire says, oh, well, what about this thing over here? And they think it's awful. Well, that might be useful information for you if you didn't think it was awful yourself, and maybe they see a flaw that you're not aware of. Okay? So communicating the things that you're aware of, that you're prioritizing, and maybe your plan for attacking them, which hopefully you have a plan. That's a different talk if you don't. That could be really helpful. Your experienced developers, they're almost always having to learn something when they come on board. So they have a lot of experience with .NET, but .NET might be very broad. It is very broad. And so they might have done a whole lot of stuff with communications in one way, but they might not have used SignalR, for example, and your organization uses that pretty heavily. They have some learning to do. That's normal. I don't think I've ever had a job that I've started that I didn't have to learn something new. Maybe one, but it's rare, right? Like your devs are learning something new. And they are not just learning the technology aspects that you're using. You're likely using libraries, open source libraries that they've never encountered before, or versions that they've never encountered before, right? So your new devs might say, wait, you're still using this? Why are you in .NET Core 3.1? Don't you know that got marked obsolete and unsupported last fall? It's like, yeah, we do know that, but we really need to get this feature out the door. It's on our priority list, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Your new devs will judge you a little bit, but if you communicate what your priorities are, your plans for addressing technical debt, the things you know about, that will be really helpful for them. But they might also say, like, hey, you're using this library for web communications. Didn't you know that this thing over here is maybe a little bit better? And that will give you maybe something to investigate and potentially adapt from their wisdom, because they are coming to you with wisdom that you didn't have on your team before. That's why you hired them. So just have a conversation about your code. Now, the other thing you have to keep in mind is that your new devs might come in with A, way too many fingers, but B, opinions about how things should work. Well, in my organization, I do things this way. I put my curly braces on this line instead of on the next line. I do X. I use var. I don't use var. Whatever it might be. People have their own preferences and idiosyncrasies. And as you're bringing them aboard, that could be something that you might want to have that conversation about. I was actually just talking to a friend of mine as he was interviewing recently, and he talked about part of the hiring process was he did a code review with experienced devs. So he was reviewing code that organization had, and they're getting to see his opinion about that code. And so some of these preferences come out in the interview process. And so like, hey, how do you think about code that's not yours? What problems do you see with this? What would you do differently? Would you do anything differently? Can you make sense of this code? Sometimes when you come across somebody who's really dogmatic about something, that might not work out. Sometimes they're going to be flexible, right? I have never worked in an organization that had exactly my preferences for code, and that's fine, that's normal, right? Part of being a healthy developer is being able to work on a team and put your preferences aside for the team's preferences. Now, if your new developer comes on and says, I always use the using statement when I'm connecting to a database because if it errors out, then the connection is closed. That might be something to listen to, right? Like if they have a compelling reason why what they prefer is better than what you prefer, like you can have that conversation as an organization and potentially add that to your backlog as technical debt to address, right? So there are good preferences. There's good things that can come out of this. But you have to temper your own preferences as you're joining an organization, and you have to expect your new hires to temper their preferences to some degree or another. Finally, your new developers are going to have a history. They're not going to be aware of the history that your code has, right? They don't necessarily know that you built the entire application on a time crunch where everybody was working crazy hours. They don't know that you were trying to meet trade deadlines, or the person that normally was responsible for this area got laid off or got a new job or whatever it might be, and you lost the knowledge for this. So communicating some of the history especially when systems change over time. Like, hey, we were doing this, we got acquired by this other bank, and they want us to not do this anymore. Talking about how your code evolves is going to help your new developers, your experienced developers, acclimate better to your code and why it is the way it is, because it's rarely going to be the way it should be. So let's talk about code standards. Code standards are nice, but what are they? Code standards are really just a collection of things that are important to you as a team. They could be like, hey, we really, it's critically important to us that our code is formatted exactly the same way. It's critically important to us. Or it could be, hey, here's our strategy for handling null. Here's our strategy for handling services that are offline. Here's our needs for auditing. Here's how we configure things with dependency injection. Here's our naming standards. These are all these things that you might care about as an organization. I would keep your standards as small as you can, but there's going to be things that matter to your team more and less than others. But if your standards are just very, very broad and it's like thou shalt do X, Y, Z, and it's 50 pages of standards, nobody's going to be able to remember them, right? So my advice is that not all your standards are created equal. Not all your rules are going to be created equal. It's probably more important to you to figure out like what the most important things to you as an organization are and have those be your first standards. You might even have 3 different standards documentations. All code must adhere to this. We recommend code adheres to this, but it's not required. Or all new code must adhere to this. And we advise you to consider this, but it's not critical. Different teams in your organization may have slightly different standards too. That's fine. But you as an organization should figure out who has standards and who has whatnot. Now, this does beg the question of, what if we get into an argument? What if we don't agree about this stuff? Because it's rare for humans to agree. I was on a team of 2 people, and it was hard for me and the other senior developer to agree on everything that we did. This was not a .NET project. Well, it had a .NET server. This was an Angular project. We were doing JavaScript. And we didn't have a number of things that we could agree on. And we didn't like that we didn't agree. And so like, well, what can we do to resolve this? And we said, oh, I know, we're both lose. We're not going to take my opinion, we're not going to take his opinion. We are going to go out and we're going to find somebody else's opinion and we're going to go with that. And so we went out and we looked at external sources of standards, external sources of style guides. And we said, well, we kind of like the Airbnb rules for this, because yes, Airbnb does have a set of JavaScript rules. We kind of like this rule set over here. This one kind of sucks in some regards. Hey, what if we just agree to use this? We don't love it, but it's the thing that we both can agree on. So in this case, both of us lost, but by losing, we kind of won because we stopped focusing on the standards we were going to use and we used somebody else's opinion that we could agree on to some degree or another. And as our team grew, we said, hey, these are our standards. And they're like, okay, cool, because we're consistent. These standards are enforced everywhere. And in fact, in the JavaScript side of things, it's easy to format your code in a very consistent way using tools like Prettier. We'll talk about formatting in a minute. So thankfully, there are standards for .NET. Microsoft has been very opinionated for many years about many of these standards, and they actually have something called Framework Design Guidelines. They have a lot of standards that are what Microsoft recommends that we follow, right? These talk about naming conventions. These talk about disposing things that are disposable. These talk about a number of things considered to be best practices. And you can go out to this URL down there or do a search for Framework Design Guidelines from Microsoft, and you'll be able to find it. I also have a copy of a 2009 book by this title if you ever want something really outdated. But Microsoft has these standards. The good news is we have access to this in Visual Studio. So in Visual Studio, we can right-click on a project and click Properties. And inside of there, you're going to find a Code Analysis tab. It's highlighted on the left on our wavy little board. And inside of that, we have the ability to check, like, hey, I want you to run code analysis on build. And then you can choose which analysis rules you want to pick. You can pick the latest ones, you can pick preview buildings, you can pick ones for specific versions of C#, right? So if your organization is using C#10, you can use C#10 recommended rules, or the C#10 minimal rules, or the C#10 all rules, right? And what's going to happen is as you get issues, they're going to show up in your build. They're going to show up as warnings, or at least as IntelliSense for suggestions. For some of them might be as extreme. Now, if you want them to be more extreme, you can actually use the little light little tooltip kind of things and configure the severity of your analyzers. So here, this is configuring the severity for all code quality analysis and saying like, hey, I want to treat all code quality warnings as warnings. Treat them all as warnings so that when I build my project, it's going to come in there and it's going to say, like, hey, you got some stuff that maybe doesn't adhere to your standards. Right? So once you have this working, now people can see the warnings as they're building. This is going to show up to your CICD tools and pipeline as well. So they'll show up in the log if you're looking at the log or the build report and things like that. Now, hopefully you and your team are looking at your warnings. If you're not looking at your warnings, this doesn't help you. But if you are looking at your warnings and actually trying to actively keep it to 0 warnings, then the warnings are going to pop up and help you see, hey, this thing that I built, I should have done it maybe a little bit differently. If you find that your team isn't caring about warnings, there's a checkbox for that. It's called instruct the compiler to treat warnings as errors. This is kind of the sociopath option, right? Hey, we got down to 0 warnings. I'm tired of you all introducing new warnings that I now have to fix. If we get a new warning, you're going to know about it. It's kind of a jerk move, but in some cases it might be the right move if your organization is not listening to what the compiler is telling it, not listening to what the analysis tools are telling you. Okay. As an instructor, I deal with students who are still learning basically this airline cockpit of our IDE. There's so many things in Visual Studio that you can do, and even in Visual Studio Code. And it can be hard for new developers to understand what all the little squigglies and underlines and annotations mean. One of the things that I'm experimenting with sometimes in teaching is this new feature called inline warnings and errors. And what this does is if you have a compiler error or compiler warning, it'll actually render on your code surface, hey, you got this warning. It makes it really hard to miss as you're going through your code. Having this in front of you during a code review, really handy, because it's like, what are you doing, Bob? It's right there in front of your face. Now, this is an experimental feature. It doesn't work the way I want it to all the time, but I think that, given a little bit of stability, this is going to be a more active thing that I think can be helpful. It is a little bit too aggressive for me to inflict on students, other than students who don't see compiler errors at all, in which case I might turn it on for them and just say, hey, it's helping you out. If you want to turn this on, you can go into Tools Options and then find C#, Text Editor C# Advanced, and then there's this Displayed Diagnostics Inline. You just check that box, and it's going to render for you in Visual Studio 2022. Actually, I think the last few versions of it have had this as well. You can also just do search options and do diagnostics inline, and you should be able to find it as well. The search features and options are really, really good. But with all of these little things we can turn on, all these little ways we can just make the code not build at all, just keep in mind, how much of a sociopath do you want to be? How cruel do you want to be to your new team members? How much do you want to slow them down? Because the amount of time that I'm experimenting with something and I'm doing like a console write line and just to understand exactly what's going on, I'm not going to keep it in there when I check in my code, but like I need my code to at least compile right now while I'm testing it. Like that's something that you care about. And if your tools won't even let you play with it temporarily, that's not amazing. Okay, so let's get back to settings and talk a little bit more about settings, because it turns out we can do a lot of really cool stuff in settings. You can go into settings for the C# or whatever language you want to program in Visual Studio. You can go down to code style, and there's this really long list of all these preferences that you and your team might have. It includes stuff like var. It includes stuff like, hey, where's the line formatting go? Where do the curly braces go? Where does X go? Do you want to use expression-bodied members, like I showed you earlier with like the fat arrow and dog ears and things like that? Does your team like that? Does your team not like that? You can configure the preferences that Visual Studio has. You can also configure whether this is going to warn or just suggest. You can even make it error. So if you really, really, really don't want anybody using var, you can make it an error. And by default, this is going to live on your machine for your user. However, there's this thing called the .editor config file. And you can use this to generate an editor config file, and that file is something you can add to your project, checking the source control, and now your other developers are going to get the preferences that you hopefully all agreed on as a team. Okay? So you can check this into your project, and now everybody's got your preferences. And Visual Studio will respect this in its refactoring preferences. It says, hey, you're using an expression-bodied member, your team likes to use this, and it'll actually give you the option to fix it across your whole project, which is really cool. Now, what's even better about your editor config files is that you can have multiple editor config files in a project. So remember what I said earlier about ski trails and difficulties? You could have, let's say you've got a namespace for authentication. You can have an .editor config file for your whole project, or maybe even your whole solution. And then you can have a .editor config file for just your authentication namespace. So you can have some specific rules that are only in this area. So it's almost like a hierarchy. So you can configure what's allowable in certain areas of the application, what's available by default, what's available inside this namespace. It is something that your organization, it might confuse people, like, hey, how come the standard is okay over here but not over here? That might be a trade-off of this. But
if you're grandfathering old code.
If you're grandfathering old code, exactly, like this, that's fine, right? Like, hey, for new code, it generally lives in this namespace or isn't in this project. These are our standards now. Another thing that can really help you, especially on the little things like tabs versus spaces and where do the curly braces go and things like that, we can choose to format on save. So you go to code cleanup settings for text editor, and you just check run code cleanup profile on save. You can configure your preferences inside of the configure code cleanup to say, like, here's the things we care about, right? But now, anytime you run your code, well, that saves automatically in Visual Studio. So anytime you run your code, it's going to clean up your code and make sure it's formatted right. So now you're not even thinking about how you format your code. It's just not an option you're thinking about. And that frees you up for a whole lot of other stuff. It doesn't always look amazing, but it frees you up to focus on other areas. So as Jeffrey just said a minute ago, not all your code is going to be equal, right? Here's a heat map I did for CodeMash 2022 at a Visualizing Code talk. I took a look at the Open Red Alert game, which is built in .NET, and I looked at their code. And this is the code files by the number of commits that they have. So these ones over here have a lot of blue. They're very dark. They don't have a whole lot of commits associated with them. But then you got like game.cs, which has over 600 commits associated with it. And so there's areas of your code in every project that get more commits than others. And those are probably the areas you need to care the most on standards about versus these other things that are rarely ever touched. Okay? The other thing you could look at is not just the number of commits on a file, but you could take a look at, say, the last modified date. So here the brighter files have been modified more recently, and the darker files have not been modified as recently. You might not care about files that are small, that are infrequently modified, and haven't been modified in a long time. Those might be areas where you really don't care about the technical debt they have. But the areas that are frequently changed, you probably want to prioritize those areas. Right? So not all your code is equal. Every project has different profiles for this. And just keep in mind that you might have standards that you adapt one day, and they're going to change the next, because your standards for code are going to evolve over time as you as individuals evolve over time, and as .NET evolves over time, and as the organization's problems and goals change over time. Right? So all of this stuff is very, very fluid and evolves. So refactoring is the idea of changing your code's style or form without changing its behavior. You're changing how it does what it does, but not necessarily what it does. So there are built-in things in Visual Studio that use these Roslyn analyzers as of, what, 5 years ago, something like that. They added the new C# compiler called Roslyn, and it has these analyzers. And it's actually able to refactor your code from one form to another. So here it's saying, like, hey, this method doesn't rely on anything local to the object, no instance data is needed. We can mark this thing as static. Well, you can use the refactoring there to change this method, but there's also options to changing everything in the file, everything in the project, or everything in the solution to follow those. So if you're following something that has a Roslyn analyzer for it, you can usually change your whole project or whole solution pretty quickly, and usually pretty safely. Now, I say usually pretty safely with an asterisk. You want to test your code. You're making a change, you got to test your code. You're running your unit tests, you are manually testing the application as you need to. Generally, these are pretty safe, but they're not always completely foolproof, especially after new updates to Visual Studio. Right? But this can really help you out. If you don't have, if there's not a Roslyn analyzer that does what you want, like if there's a code smell that you really hate, it's technically possible for you to go out and write your own Roslyn analyzer and check that into your project. And so now anybody who's working with your project has that analyzer and can run it. So you can codify your own code styles. Now, I've never met a team that had the time to write their own Roslyn analyzers to enforce their own style guides. But that would be the pipe dream, right? Like you're enforcing, you have this automated thing that detects violations of your most egregious issues and maybe even automatically fixes them. That's the pipe dream there. So Visual Studio can do a lot of this stuff. But there are some tools out there that can also help if you're looking at commercial or free tools. So Sonar Cloud and Sonar Cube is a either cloud-based or self-hosted tool that will analyze your code on check-in. It's going to help you define violations of standards, areas that maybe need a little bit more attention. We have this information, a lot of this information in Visual Studio. I generally find Sonar Cloud to have a pretty good degree of trustworthiness. If it gives you a violation, it's usually something you want to pay attention to in C# is what I've seen, which is nice. CodeScene is another one out there. It's a little expensive in my book, but it is it has some unique values because it say, hey, what are the files that are frequently modified together? What files are modified very infrequently? What files are only modified by one person? You might need to start sharing them with other people. So you can get some more like team dynamic kind of information out of CodeScene. It's not necessarily built for .NET, but it can work with .NET files. And then Independ is the last one, and I love Independ. It is pricey, but it can really help you out with a lot of cool stuff. Now, full disclosure, I know the guy who writes this. We've been communicating for 8 years now or something like that. So I'm not, it's not like I don't have a party in the horse. Like I know the guy who does Independ. Nice guy over in London. But Independ can give you like these nice interactive graphs that you can kind of generate and zoom in on, and it's almost like you're looking at like CSI your code, and you're seeing like how does everything relate to everything else. So here's like how do all my namespaces relate? And boy, there's a whole lot of code in openra.mods.com, and boy, does a whole lot of that code rely on openra.game. Same with the command and conquer mod over there on the far left, lower left. So you can sort of see how do my things relate to each other. This is like a project level dependency graph. But you can also get like namespace level dependency graphs and like, hey, inside of my namespace, what are my major types? What are my nested namespaces? How do they relate to other things? And what on earth is this mess of spaghetti right here? Can be really nice to get a glimpse of your current architecture. Can be useful for communicating your architecture with people. It is pricey, but it might be worth taking a look at. Okay? But you can do a lot with Visual Studio out of the box. Independ also gives you some ways of doing tree maps, kind of like I showed you earlier. So this is a tree map of the size of your code and then the cyclomatic complexity, the number of unique paths through each method in your code. So this can help you find big files that have a high degree of cyclomatic complexity, for example. Right? Helps you pinpoint things. As a manager, I use stuff like this a lot to say like, hey doctor, it hurts right here. Let me fix this, please. Right? Like things like this were really, really helpful. So let's close by talking about some things you can do beyond just code standards to help people succeed in your organization. So first of all, I would recommend an onboarding buddy. A couple years ago at Momentum Conference in Cincinnati, I heard a wonderful new developer, I can't remember her name, but she was talking about her onboarding experience at Kroger and how they had an onboarding buddy. It's like, hey, you're joining the organization, I'm in the organization, I know kind of what you're going to be going through, I'm your buddy for the next 3 months. Anytime you have a question, ask me, I'm happy to help you, I'm going to be checking in with you regularly. Having somebody that's like kind of your go-to person is awesome. And if you can't go to that person, that's cool. Other people will help you too. But this person is being rewarded, like part of their compensation is built around, and performance evaluation is built around them helping you succeed, right? That can really be helpful if you can do that for your new devs, right? And that might not even be a senior person, that might be a mid-level person who succeeded in onboarding recently. Another thing they do at Kroger that I really liked from this presentation was they did this retrospective. Hey, you've been here 90 days. Let's talk about your onboarding experience. What was hard? What was confusing? What parts of the code were hard? What parts of setting up your machine was hard? What stopped you from being even more awesome than you are? And they do these retrospectives regularly. And I think those kinds of things, even if your organization doesn't hire often, are good to do, because if you don't hire often now, you might be hiring often in a minute. Or you never know when somebody's going to leave your organization, you're going to need to replace them. Okay? So these are little things you can do that are going to drastically improve your onboarding experience for your new hires. Okay, I talked about wikis having some sort of an internal knowledge base, even if it's just a Google Doc. One resource I can go to to figure out where something is or what something is really, really helpful. New hires are often ashamed of asking the same question twice. They ask a question, they don't write it down the answer, or they can't write down the answer because they're in the hallway and you're just talking over lunch or whatever. They feel bad about asking for help again. Having a centralized place where they can go to find help on something is really important. Give your new hires access to edit this though. Like when they're coming in, they're gonna find gaps. Let them edit it, let them add value to your documentation, maybe even before they're adding value to your code. And then you might even want to re-examine the hiring process. If you're noticing a lot of your hires are exhibiting the same behaviors or failing in the same way, you might want to think about what you're hiring for. If they're struggling to deal with this library, okay, or are we looking for people that have experience with this library or something similar to it? Are we being forthcoming about something? We're not getting people who are applying for this job. Or do we have maybe too many requirements? Are all these requirements necessary for this role? So periodically re-examine your hiring process. And this last one is going to shock you, but just having technical debt is fine. But what if we actually started paying that down? Like, what if you actually started improving your code and making it more the way it ought to be? You're going to give everybody a better experience learning how your code is, how it's structured, how it should be structured, how it works. You're going to have a better chance of success for your new developers of various experience levels. All this to say, there is no silver bullet. There is no one process that you could do to help people succeed in your organization. But there are some ideas that might be helpful for you. I'm not telling you not to use var unless you're my student. Don't use var. I'm not telling you not to do microservices. You might need microservices. I'm telling you that everything in tech has a price. Everything in tech has a trade-off. There's no one right answer for something, but you as a team can start finding answers that work pretty well for your organization, and you can evolve those over time. All right, so ignoring AI oddities, some key takeaways for you from this talk. Let's see, standards can help, but not everything needs to be in a standards document. Just because you can put where your braces go in a standard document doesn't mean they should go there. Put your most important thing in your standard document, otherwise people are going to get overwhelmed with all the things you want to enforce. And your standards document might be small. It's like, hey, we're based on .NET 10 recommended with these additions or with these subtractions. We care about this, but also this. The style guide can really help you resolve conflicts, especially on tabs versus spaces and curly bracement placing and things like that. Having a way of automatically formatting your code can really reduce a lot of conflicts and help people focus on just the code. Let's see, tools can help automate compliance. So if you integrate something like your CICD, your build pipeline, it's running your code analysis checks, and before it even moves it on to code review, if it fails it and tells the developer, hey, nice try, but this really should be in a using statement, for example. Like, that's going to help somebody know the right way of doing the code to begin with, right? It's going to point out warnings and stuff like that. Additionally, the refactoring tools can help you clean up your code across the whole project, but you still need to test it because they don't always get it completely right. When you are adding complexity, see if you can take away complexity elsewhere. If you're like, hey, this is a cool new feature, well, that's nice, but what are we keeping simple elsewhere? Are we doing this everywhere? Consistency is really important, especially for newer developers joining your organization. And then finally, a healthy wiki can really help people out. All right. What questions do you have? What experiences do you have that you'd like to share? What you got?
I'm curious, what would your dictionary definition of technical debt be?
Technical debt is, well, I used to have a really good definition of that. I'm not giving that talk in a couple years now. Technical debt is code that's risky, right? It is code that is a risk to future development. So technical debt is code that's going to slow you down. It's code that's going to maybe hide bugs. It's code that's maybe going to break in a few years. It's code that's not the way that you want to have written it right now, but it's potentially going to cause you issues down the road. Okay? So that might be you are cutting corners. It might be that your requirements changed, but your code is different than it ought to be. What you got?
A good definition I heard is any code that's not covered by unit tests.
That would be Michael Feathers wrote that. Yeah, and Michael Feathers says, I think it's Working Effectively with Legacy Code is the book that he has that on. Michael Feather says technical debt is code that doesn't have tests. And it's a very extreme definition, but I like it. I'm not sure I agree with it, but I do like the definition.
Could be inflexible code.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah.
I view technical debt as risk to your organization that something's going to break, or you're just going to be spending more and more of your time writing the same code because it's duplicated everywhere, right? Technical debt has some form of risk associated with it, whether it's productivity, security, or something else. That's my definition.
Thank you.
I was just thinking on something you said with these global refactoring tool capabilities.
Yes.
I probably would not mix feature development with like some global refactorings and changing
Yes.
files in the commit.
Because if I'm making a new feature and I'm sending it on to Sean over here to review, Sean's taking a look at my feature, and alongside of that, I'm changing every other file in the organization's history to comply with my new standards. He's going to be very confused and mad. And also, I used to work with Sean, so I might actually have done that to Sean. So I'm very sorry, Sean. That is the sort of thing I used to do. But yeah, keep your commits separate. Paying down technical debt, you can maybe have a task per sprint. It's like, hey, we're going to pay down this targeted type of technical debt. And you test that separately, you review that separately. Question? Just move extra as you can. What do you got?
Do you have any tips or thoughts on securing management buy-in when it comes to things that are going to require that?
Yes, I do. So the best ways of getting management's buy-in or support as you're trying to tackle technical debt is to frame technical debt not as developers didn't do their job right to begin with, which is occasionally true, but less true than you might think. I frame it instead of, hey, standards have evolved, standards have changed, we tried to build this for X, and the code that we have right now has risk associated with it. There's not enough tests associated with it. It's not following adequate standards. We really need to pay this down. We view this particular piece of technical debt as taking 2 hours to fix and test, and having a cost, a rough cost of 1 hour per month. Every month we don't fix it, of developer time. So as soon as you can reframe things as risk to organizational leadership, that tends to help them understand, oh, this is not just something I can ignore, because if you ignore it, you get Southwest Airlines. No offense to Southwest Airlines, but they had it coming. They didn't pay down their technical debt, and then people couldn't fly. Turns out technical debt's important. It is risk. I'm open to other ideas from folks in the room of all experience levels too.
In a nutshell, remember, I've done more support work than new development.
Sure, yeah.
Remember, somebody comes after you. And in early part of your talk, I couldn't help but remember this VB program that somebody handed me. Not because it's VB, there's nothing wrong with VB, but it was many years ago, but this guy packed every bit of whiz-bang, bells and whistles.
This guy was me, right?
I'm going to show you what I know, all these cool things.
Yep.
And, putting hooks in and, catching, intercepting things, crazy stuff.
Yep.
And I'm handed this and I'm like, what do I do with that? What is even happening here? And I'm surprised you didn't mention the comment you see sometime where it says, I don't know what the heck this does, but I'm afraid to touch it.
Yeah. Please increment the counter of number of times, the number of hours you spent on this, right? Like, yeah. And I was that guy.
Remember, somebody's coming after you.
I was that guy, right? Like, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I love programming. Programming's so fun. Oh, this new feature is so neat. Well, I'm the only one who works on this code, so I'm just going to add that new feature. That's cool. I'm gonna use this code style. That's cool. And then, you'll notice I have a cane, right? Like, I injured my knee actually in rehab 7 years ago, but I was paralyzed for a while. And when I was paralyzed, I was out for 3 months, we'll say, total time. And during that time, other people had to come in and maintain my old code while I was on the bench. And then I came in 3 months later, and I took over my old code. I'm like, dear God, this man had no comments. Who wrote this? Oh, of course, it was all me. Right? And believe me, when you have to come back to your code after 3 months of not touching it, you have a different appreciation for comments and tests and keeping things simple. Because simple things are a lot less likely to break. It's a lot easier to add complexity than it is to take it away from a system.
And simple doesn't mean less lines of code.
No.
There are many times I'd rather see twice the number of lines of code because I can understand it.
Oh, just getting back to our dog example.
Yeah, you really hit some nerves with me as a support guy.
Yeah. And this was me, right? Like if you look at my side projects, I'm doing this all over the place because that's what side projects are. They're good for testing and playing with things and say, do I like this practice? Do I like this or not? Once I started playing first with new language features and new libraries and stuff like that in a side project before inflicting it on production code, people wanted to kill me less, right, as coworkers. Now, they still want to kill me a little bit, but not as much as they used to. So I think the saying was always pretend that the person comes after you has an axe and knows where you live, or something like that, right? Like, yeah. You'll also see the memes on Programmer Humor of like the bell curve. Your new developers, hey, let's write super simple code. Your senior developers, oh, I'm going to have an interface for everything. Everything needs dependency injection, everything is fancy. Your staff engineers, everything's really simple, right? The simple stuff doesn't break as much. I don't trust myself not to break code. I don't trust myself not to make mistakes, and I certainly don't trust my coworkers not to make mistakes. Write simple code.
If it takes you an hour to figure out what 3 or 4 lines of code do, because it's going here, and then that's going there, and that's going there, and it's all abstracted beyond belief.
And don't,
there's a place for doing things direct.
and nested ternary should not be in our conversation at all.
Well, that's how you fix FizzBuzz, right?
Next question.
I always try to, one client I was at they had an application overview of their entire organization for like new people.
Yep.
And the one thing that was missing from that, it was great because they showed how it all kind of at a high level worked together. I always try to map that to an org chart, like who works on this now, who used to work on this, so I can go find the, so the who matters too. Where you need that.
Yeah. All right. I'll be around to chat afterwards if you want to talk to me. If you're watching online, you can reach out to me at matt.eland@gmail.com or hit me up on Twitter @integerman. Probably comment on the video, though I don't watch our videos as much. But I'm happy to chat with this stuff later on. Who's ready for the raffle? Okay. So we're going to